Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third Engage webinar entitled Winter Has Come, EU Energy Security and the Russian War on Ukraine. My name is Gustavo Müller. I'm a researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven in Belgium, which is a partner of the Engage Consortium. Engage is a Horizon 2020 project that looks into how the EU can effectively and sustainably meet strategic challenges by utilizing all of its tools of external action and by consequence become a more assertive global actor. To do so, Engage brings together 13 academic institutions and think tanks from across Europe. You can know more about Engage by checking its website, that's engage-eu.eu, and subscribe to its newsletter. Now to today's topics: energy security, winter has come, EU energy security and the Russian war on Ukraine. Now we have all felt it in one way or another. Energy security is perhaps the one issue, along with food security, that spills over from the Russian war in Ukraine to most, if not all, of European countries and beyond. Prices of energy have skyrocketed, fueling inflation in an already challenging post-pandemic context. There is insecurity vis-a-vis supply this winter, but especially now, the next one. Countries have been forced to make adjustments in terms of diversification of supply, but also efficiency gains in their consumption. With the war in Ukraine, the green transition is certainly getting a new momentum. While internationally, Europe tries to keep its pledge for a reduction of gas emissions, at home, it also has to keep their homes warm and the factories working, while at the same time helping other regions to do the same transition while developing. So questions in that sense are as numerous as the consequences when it comes to energy security. What's the origin, for instance, of such dependence on natural gas on one particular country, in this instance, Russia? How can European countries and the EU best secure and adjust their energy market to outstand such shocks in the future? What is the role of the EU therein, both in Europe, but also internationally when it comes to securing energy security? And finally, what's the outlook? How does energy transition and geopolitics look like in the midst of a war in the European continent? Now, to discuss this and other questions, including questions from you in the audience, we have the pleasure to welcome three experts on energy security, energy transition, and the geopolitics of energy, including the European Union therein. Marie Vandendriessche is Senior Researcher and Research Coordinator at ESAT-GEO, Center for Global Economy and Geopolitics in Barcelona. Her work focuses on the interface between energy and climate change, covering policy, global governance, and geopolitics. Marie, thank you very much for being with us here today. We also welcome Yana Popkostova. She is Associate Analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies, as we know, EU-ISS, focusing on the environmental security portfolio. She investigates the compound security challenges posed by climate change, environmental degradation, ecosystems depletion, focusing particularly on mechanisms to mitigate and prevent impacts on European security and foreign policy. Thank you very much, Yana, for joining us as well. And finally, we're also very happy to welcome Kremer. Christian is Associate Senior Fellow at GlobSec in Slovakia, and he's also former Deputy Secretary General for the European People's Party, the EPP. Christian focuses on the policy solutions to combat climate change and increase our share in low carbon and carbon-free energy sources. Thank you very much, Christian, as well for joining us. So we are very well equipped to deal with all those very challenging questions when it comes to energy security and the impact to the European Union of the Russian war on Ukraine. Thank you all for being here with us today. I suggest that we follow the order of the presentations, with Marie followed by Yana and then Christian. Each of our panelists will give us an initial talk between 5 and 10 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A with you in the audience. You can ask us questions by using the Q&A button that you're going to find at the bottom of your screen. Now, without further ado, let's dive into energy security, because winter has indeed come, as we can already feel throughout Europe. Marie, on to you for your initial comments.
Thanks, Gustavo. Thanks for this introduction and for organizing as well on a very important topic with many topics to discuss, of course. And so what I'll do in my initial remarks is to give a bit of a macro perspective on geopolitics of energy kind of today, with the Russian invasion falling in the middle of that, and what that might imply for the wider picture as well. The intention is really to kind of set a big stage, and then I know that Yana and Christian have prepared some great remarks on more concrete topics within that. So perhaps just to stimulate a little bit the conversation that will come forward. Essentially, when the crisis hit in February 2022, geopolitics of energy and energy security were already high on policymakers' agendas. This is not something that all of a sudden popped onto the agenda. And essentially, kind of the big picture was that we are engaged in what is known as the fourth energy transition, right? It's energy transition between the old energy system, which has been based on fossil fuels essentially for the past 2 centuries in the West, shorter in the rest of the world, and a system that is now going towards a system that's more based on renewables and zero or low carbon sources. Of course, a transition means that we are essentially in the middle of 2 systems at the same time. And so balancing the risks of the old and the new is a question that was really at the top of the table already, I would argue, before all of this hit. But perhaps it's become even more important. And so we have to balance the risks that we know and the risks that we need to still prepare for, that we can't completely foresee, but we're preparing for at this time. So this is the big picture. This is where we are. And then in February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. And old geopolitics, so to speak, slams right into us, right? So the old geopolitics related to security of supply of fossil fuel sources of natural gas really hits us hard. Gas is used as a weapon in a war, essentially. Now, the EU, of course, has had a long-standing dependence on natural gas from Russia. And one of its policy goals for a long time has been to decrease that dependence. However, despite having that goal, in fact, dependence on Russian gas had increased. And that contradictory result essentially comes from 2 main factors, which is that natural gas production domestically in the EU was declining, where, on the other hand, Russian gas is just across the border, relatively cheap. And even though tense relations we've had tense relations with Russia for quite some time, there was a trust that the interdependent relationship whereby Russia wanted to sell the gas to the EU as its consumer would be balanced by the EU needing the gas. And so this interdependent relationship led to this increased dependence over time. Readily available and cheap gas across the border really helped to keep this going. But of course, that trust proved to be wrong. Now, at the same time, of course, it wasn't just about this policy goal of reducing dependency on Russian gas. The EU has been working hard towards increasing its share of renewables in the mix and towards increasing its energy efficiency. That's something that's been doing for decades and has certainly been driving up as emissions reduction goals increase when climate change kind of continues to grow on this agenda. But again, and I know this is a point that Christian will speak to, gas was to some extent seen as a little bit the backup to this question. So we could continue to invest in these renewables because we had a stable baseline kind of to start from. So again, we see multiple factors pushing us towards this reliance on natural gas and this reliance on natural gas from Russia. But then, of course, February 2022 hits. Russia uses gas as a weapon. But actually, it's not just February 2022. Before that, we were already seeing what was happening. Energy prices were increasing around the world, and that was related to many factors, one of them being post-COVID recovery. But another one was, and we see this more, I think, with hindsight, that Russia did start to taper to some extent its supply of gas to Europe ahead of its invasion, perhaps to weaken the EU ahead of what was to come. When it then decides to invade Ukraine, it does not cut off its full supply to gas immediately, but it cuts it off gradually. Currently, currently we are importing about 8%, whereas we used to import 40% of our gas from Russia. That's quite a cut. So while Russia decides to cut off its supply, the EU also decides that it no longer wants to pay for this fossil fuel, both gas and oil, from Russia, and therefore pay into the war coffers of the Russian state. So really we see a situation where energy becomes a critical element within this geopolitical, this foreign policy struggle. In order for the EU to be able to withstand the supply shock of not having this Russian gas, really a tremendous emergency response was mustered. And of course, we can talk about the details of it, and there were lights and shadows among it. But really, there has been a tremendous, very quick emergency response with the Repower EU plan, quickly launched, then further detailed sanctions packages going underway. Oil has recently come into the mix, and there's currently still discussions on how to further operationalize, for example, the G7 quotient of the refined products. But it's not just, of course, about this. It's also about how do we make up for the supply that we've lost. And really there, tools of both the old and the new system were employed. So on the one hand, we need to make up immediately for that shortfall, and we do that by importing more LNG, creating the infrastructure to import that, whether it's floating or fixed. We ask our alternative suppliers of gas to increase their supply to us. But at the same time, we accelerate those other two pillars that we were talking about before, which is the renewable energies and the energy efficiency, right? So really employing tools of both sides of things. And so coming back to my initial point and where I started from, this geopolitics of the energy transition, the provision currently done by the International Energy Agency is that the mid and long-term effect of all of this is that energy transition, that fourth energy transition that we were talking about, is actually going to accelerate as an effect of the invasion and the measures that were put into place after that. So this is important and necessary because the fight against climate change necessitates this transition. But at the same time, it also means that volatility that I was speaking of before, that necessity to mitigate the risks on both sides of the equation is not going to go away, is in fact going to intensify. And so studying geopolitically the strategies that we need to put into place to mitigate the risks of the old while also addressing the risks of the new is really going to be, I think, at the heart of any energy security agenda in the EU and also our other parts of the world going forward. So that's just a little bit something to warm up, to start off with, a lot of different points, and I know that Yana and Christian will engage with many of them in much more detail.
Thank you so much, Marie, for this well-informed overview and recap of everything that happened in the last year or so. But as you pointed out, that there's underpinnings of the current situation that date far behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine as well. Now, with that, let me move on directly to Yana, for your take as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Gustavo, for the kind introduction and for bringing us together to untangle the Gordian knot of energy security, sustainability and geopolitics in a strategic context for the EU. And thank you, Mari, for this really kind of a helicopter view of what are the key challenges going forward, and especially the geopolitical and macroeconomic perspective. So, Gustavo, you alluded at the very beginning in your introduction that the EU dwells in an unprecedented poly-crisis environment. You mentioned the COVID lingering impacts, the Ukraine invasion, the inflation pressures, but we should also underline that we have a global escalating cost of living crisis, disrupted supply chains, global debt servicing crisis, but also the persistent challenges of climate change with historic droughts, aridity, and storm records reached in 2022 that only reveal the intensifying climate emergency. And that would produce dramatic structural reconfiguration of our energy security and impact the action on also sustainability and climate change. And as identified by Marie very eloquently, the wider geopolitical impacts are striking as well. Commodity prices and markets, as well as global energy alliances, experienced unprecedented gyrations, juxtaposing the traditional geopolitics of energy with the nascent geopolitics of decarbonization or net zero. And the period of volatility will be protracted and impact the remainder of the decade. And I think it's critical for us to be conscious of that. So this is the context in which we operate. Now, the disruption prompted by the Ukraine invasion reveals a chronic structural problems in the energy sector that would have caused problems in EU energy and environmental policy irrespective of the conflict itself. We have, by purpose or negligence, ignored deficiencies and loopholes across the different dimensions of the so-called energy trilemma of security, sustainability, and equity. And the current context really forces us to confront these failures and stress test our energy system going forward. And the trajectory of the energy transition is critical here. Official pronouncements proclaim stoic support of the net zero economy, notably with the Repower EU package. A lot has been achieved. Maria alluded to the ramped up renewable energy commitments, but also there is the upgraded hydrogen ambition, demand destruction achieved across the EU. The EU was also successful in attracting LNG cargoes, filling in gas inventories, and developing contingency plans to ramp up supply networks with Africa, the Caucasus region. And there is a really embedded uncertainties there as well that I would like to maybe discuss later on in the Q&A session. But at the same time, controversial consumer subsidization and massive utilities bailouts have also become a permanent feature, distorting the most important achievement of the EU policy evolution, the liberalized internal energy market, with state intervention today becoming the norm. And I think this is concerning. Further, the endeavor has a very hefty price tag, with blanket subsidization of the consumer clearly not sustainable. The issue of equity within and amongst member states is also critical, with current cacophony of measures clearly confronting welfare against financially weaker member states that could impact cohesion and widen the energy poverty predicament along the familiar west-east or north-south axis. Squeezed budgets could also compromise EU global climate finance disbursement. Sending money abroad can be difficult to justify to electorate in the current situation and conditions. Simultaneously, while we invest in bolstering our domestic gas infrastructure, we persist in affronting fossil fuel projects in third countries. This fuels hypocrisy accusations and can be detrimental to EU's global role and ability to broaden sustainability action. And amidst all of that, the global situation and market dynamics are absolutely essential to inform our foresight and planning for hydrocarbons, but also green commodities and manufacturing industries. Global oil markets are extremely tight today. Spare refining capacity is virtually non-existent, and the oil market fragmentation based on origin, absolutely unprecedented historically, is an issue that merits vigilant attention. The current capacity constraints are due to multiple factors, and we can discuss them later on, but the chronic underinvestment is critical amongst those factors, and this is a public policy failure. The oil and refined products embargoes, as well as the price cap, in combination with the OPEC plus remarkable discipline and the Chinese demand return, would only tighten markets and hit difficult times for the global economy in the year ahead. Gas markets are in even more dire situation, despite really kind of the dominant optimism that is reigning at the dawn of 2023. The EU has been lucky, we have to admit that. The price premium in European markets, together with tempered demand in China, have attracted LNG cargoes to the EU, replacing the lost Russian volumes. But the dark side of this is that many volumes have been cannibalized from financially weaker states, such as Pakistan, that have been completely priced out of the market. Going forward, LNG capacity extensions will be coming online not before 2025, even later. And securing the EU procurement for 23 and 24 might be an arduous task without Russian volumes, in competition with China, and if the lack of a mild weather does not strike again. And this reveals structural problems. Clean energy generation has clearly been ramped up and prioritized, but without the essential stress testing of the system to intermittency challenges or to potential shocks to extreme weather, cyber or hybrid risks to generation within and beyond the EU. And this all would have created crisis with or without the Ukraine conflict. In addition, today, we need to hit dangers related to green commodities, access constraints, and soaring costs, where the risk for Europe of replacing current with new chronic dependencies is not negligible. Incentivizing innovation in emerging technologies for net zero is essential. Hydrogen, CCUS, long duration battery storage. And here the big challenge is supply chains. Costs for solar and wind turbine components already experience inflation, and demand is only going to intensify, as we read in most of the IEA projections. There is also going to be a massive scramble to access the metals to build out electrification, from steel, key base metals, including copper, aluminum, and nickel, and battery raw materials. And this part of the vector has been somehow ignored by our emphasis on the critical rare earths and minerals. The deindustrialization predicament should also be discussed, especially in the context of what's happening in the US in the Inflation Reduction Act. Even if we secure enough metals and minerals, the lack of refining capacity makes stockpiles absolutely important. So we need to tackle this vector as well. Optimizing and modernizing the grid that is absolutely not fit for purpose today should also be prioritized. So there is a lot of moving plates. The global situation and supply chains need to be carefully evaluated, and we need heightened diplomatic efforts on this vector, avoid competition and protectionism, and reactivate industrial partnerships. And this is absolutely a critical point going forward. So the talk about the orderly transition that caters to and bolsters the priorities of security, sustainability, and affordability seems very chimeric today, especially given the acute market deficiencies that we underline. So I will stop here. I'm happy to explore further any of the points I made later in the discussion. Back to you, Gustavo.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Yana, for describing and analyzing these moving plates of what you pointed out as being a polycrisis, right? And also for highlighting the issues of equity and industrialization therein, which we're going to come back to in the Q&A, I'm sure, as well. Now, without further ado, Christian, for your initial thoughts as well on the issue of energy, but in particular also on the consequences of the Russian war in Ukraine. On to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gustavo, and thanks to everyone involved in the organization of this webinar. I think we can see on the number of participants that, it is timely and it's an important issue, that people feel we have to discuss. As Maria said in her introduction, of course, Russia and many people did not expect that. I mean, in the end, we have imported throughout Soviet Union times, we have imported gas into European countries, but indeed, Russia weaponized gas. And I think it is fair to say that at the moment, at least, the weaponization didn't really work out for them. Of course, we are not through this. There is not only this winter, but there is also next winter. Gas storages are still quite full, but the question is, will we, without Russian gas, be able to fill them up over the summer 23 in order to get through the next winter? There is still, I think, an open question, and it depends, of course, very much on how much LNG we will be able to get. But to get back again on the numbers, I think we have had enormous achievements by Repower EU, by different member states trying to find new sources for LNG, to go down from 40% Russian gas to 8% now, from 2021 to now, is very remarkable. In Germany, even, we went down from 50% to 0. That's even more remarkable. We see similar trends also regarding crude oil after the decisions that have been taken on European level. Of course, the refined products coming in now in a bit more than a week from now. So we have to see also, as Yana has indicated already, what will this mean for especially for the provision of diesel in the EU. Diesel is a very important fuel for freight transport and so on. So that is certainly something we have to keep an eye on. But when it comes to, Russia being able to finance its war, of course, the high energy prices, even with Russia selling gas and oil to lower prices to countries such as India and China, they still manage to, generate a lot of income to finance their war, unfortunately. But I think it is fair to say that after this weaponization of energy, EU countries are not going to go back to a dependency from Russia that we have seen before. So that means also the use of natural gas to the extent to which we have used it before is called into question, because the question will be, are we able to rely on the longer term on the amounts of gas through LNG that we have received from Russia through pipelines before? So the gas storages are still quite full. We managed a 20% consumption reduction in average in the EU, which is also remarkable. So it's all good, basically. Well, honestly, it is a little bit more complicated than that. As I said, the next winter, is still going to be a challenge in terms of gas provision. The other issue that we have certainly, and that we should not underestimate for poorer countries around the world, we are buying LNG at high prices globally, and others, as Yana has pointed out earlier, are not able to provide themselves with the amounts of gas they need. So this is certainly an issue. And of course, prices remain very high, costing us wealth in our societies and in our economies, and costing us industrial competitiveness. If you see, for example, now, or if you look on announcements of the chemical industry in Germany, for example, they will move large parts of production outside Germany and outside Europe to places like the US, like countries in Asia, where energy is cheaper. And of course, a deindustrialized Europe, even though we would, save emissions on paper, but it cannot be the goal for anyone, because of course the emissions are not saved in the end. They are produced somewhere else. And then there is, of course, the issue not only of energy security, but there is our commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions according to what we decided in the Paris Agreement, and also in the respective legislation on European level. So how is it going with moving towards net zero? Well, honestly, not so well, because we see a revival of coal in electricity generation, replacing gas. We can see in many countries at the moment that gas is still used in electricity generation, but only to the amount that is absolutely necessary and that cannot be filled in by other sources, and that is mainly coal. And as I'm German, just want to put the numbers from Germany on the table when it comes to coal-fired power plants. The current government has reactivated, notably under a green minister for economy and climate, 27 old coal and lignite plants with a total capacity of 10 gigawatt, which is quite enormous, and which has, of course, a quite disastrous effect on carbon emissions of the electricity mix. Mind you, lignite has emissions of around 1,200 gram per kilowatt hour. So that is approximately 4 times what gas emits. So that is, of course, not good news for moving towards, a more climate-friendly energy mix. It was always, when we talk about the energy transition towards renewables, and when we speak about renewables, we speak in the first place about wind and solar, because hydropower, we are using already in most countries what we can use. I mean, you cannot just create that much of new hydropower capacities, and even if you would want it, you would run into serious difficulties because people will not be very much in favor of it. So we are talking about wind and sun, and it has always a little bit be the dark side of wind and solar power, that it needed gas as a backup, because of course, as you know, wind and solar, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So in order to deal with this intermittency, gas was the natural partner, because the combined cycle, gas fired plants, you can, fire them up very quickly, much more quickly than you can do it with coal and with nuclear. So we have seen a big increase of gas-fired electricity generation, especially in countries like Germany, in the past 10 years, to compensate for this intermittency. And in the coming years, I think it is fair to say we will see less gas and more coal, as we have seen already throughout the last year, for generating baseload electricity and for compensating for the unavailability of renewables. I want to put in a question that you don't hear very much about, and that's the question: is gas actually as environmentally friendly as we think it is? Because, of course, when you look on the statistics, you see that gas emits, I think, 300 something gram per kilowatt hour. So this is, among all the fossil fuels, by far the best. But of course, this equation is missing the methane leakage. And I mean, there have been throughout the past 5-6 years quite a few studies about, estimating how much methane leaks at the wells, in the transport, in the pipeline system before it is used. And when you take a deeper look into these studies, you actually see that gas is not that environmentally friendly. It is probably still better than coal, but it is probably not better than oil. So the 300 something gram that we see when we look on gas, they are not the full truth. So I think we have to also get a little bit more honest on that. And certainly when we speak about fracking gas from the US, there are studies that, especially with the smaller wells, there are real problems. The Biden administration has been trying now to tackle this with, enhancing regulation and undoing, what Trump has done before. They're basically abolishing all regulation on the old wells. But if we really want to tackle climate change, we have to look on all these issues and not just get, excited about low numbers for gas. But I just want to put on the table as a side note. And don't forget, methane emissions at the moment are highest they have ever been in human history, probably already through feedback loops, melting, permafrost in the Arctic, but certainly a lot of it because of more gas exploration activity in the past 10 years. And just that as a last number, according to the IPCC, methane is contributing currently 25% to global warming. So it is an important factor to take into account. So will a more rapid transformation to wind and solar solve the problem? Because if you follow, for example, the German debate, this is what you hear. We were not fast enough. We have to build more wind and more solar power in order to reduce our emissions. Well, I checked again how it is looking this morning. Wind is producing at 5% of capacity in Germany, at a staggering 0.5% in Belgium. Well, sun, you can guess it, Brussels in the winter. So that means, of course, we always need a full-scale backup to deal with the intermittency, and especially in the winter, from 19th of November 22 until 17th of December, almost a full 4 weeks. We had a period with almost no wind, with the exception a bit of the Iberic Peninsula, but almost nowhere in Europe there was any wind. And that means it was fossil fuels, and it was basically coal generating our electricity. And when it comes to electricity generation, there's one important point we have to take into account. We can talk about, more saving more energy, becoming more efficient. But in order to become more efficient, we will need more energy, and electric energy especially, because we will have to electrify through heat pumps the building sector. That's indispensable to decarbonize the building sector. We will have to move towards electric cars, in the transport sector. So we will need more electricity, and we will need not less electricity. So there is, of course, where hydrogen comes in. And I don't know, was it Yana or Marie? Someone spoke already about the hype, and it is indeed a hype in Brussels at the moment to speak about hydrogen. And there is absolutely no doubt that green hydrogen and also blue hydrogen will have to play an important role in the decarbonization, especially in the industrial processes, in the chemical industry, in producing steel and cement, two major, emitting industries of greenhouse gases. But I am honestly very, very doubtful that hydrogen will be the silver bullet for energy storage. Of course, you can use hydrogen as energy storage, but whereas batteries have an efficiency of about 95%, hydropower is a little bit below that, I think. Hydrogen is at best at 50% efficiency, at worst around 30% efficiency. I mean, those people who really think we are going to import by ship large amounts of hydrogen as energy storage to fire them afterwards in combined cycle plants to produce electricity, has to keep in mind that we will have to produce 3 times the amount of electricity in Africa, the Middle East, or wherever with renewables than we actually have as energy to use in the end in Europe. And then I ask myself the question, would it not be better to produce chemical products, steel or whatever, directly in Africa or the Middle East, and to use all the energy that you produce with renewables instead of losing 70% in the process? There's also quite a few questions regarding the electrolyzers that are used until now. They are basically running on full capacity 24/7. There are new models for electrolyzers, but we don't have this on scale. And I have to warn a little bit for too much wishful thinking, because the combating climate change doesn't allow for us for too much wishful thinking. And I also would like to remind that in the end, Europe is also seen as an example that others will follow or not follow, depending how successful we are. And then my last point is that leaves, of course, with, one carbon-free energy that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is nuclear energy that can be used as carbon-free baseload energy. And in fact, when we look on the electricity mixes of different countries, we can come to one clear conclusion. Those countries that have managed to basically decarbonize their electricity mix have done so either with hydropower, those countries like Norway, for example, that have a lot of hydropower available, or with nuclear, like France, or with both of them, like Sweden. Those are probably, the countries that have managed, for the largest part, their decarbonization of the electricity mix already. And if you look on the yearly average, and I don't want to come with too many, specific numbers of the day, But if you look on the electricity mix 2022 between France and Germany, despite having had over 400 billion of investment into renewable energy in the past 20 years, Germany still has an electricity mix that is 5 times as carbon intensive as France is. And therefore, I think we have to adjust a little bit our policy on a European level, and we have to be able to use all the low carbon and carbon free sources that are available in order to really, match our climate change goals and, again, to be also an example for the world in showing how we are able to decarbonize our energy consumption. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian, for unpacking all of this, the energy mix, right? The challenges and the myths associated with many of them as well. While we were talking, I think all three of you actually highlighted that we are in a transition phase. We have been for quite a while, which recalls that metaphor that we are currently changing the tires of the car while the car is moving, right? And if anything, the Russian war in Ukraine has accelerated that car and accelerated the challenges of making that transition that would be, in that sense, not only the tires of the car, but we're actually changing the engine, right? It makes it a little bit more complicated from fossil fuels to electricity and so on and so forth. Well, some questions are already coming in. I'm going to target some of the questions to our panelists specifically, but let me start with a more general question, which has to do with where we stand 1 year into the war in Ukraine, with the Russian war in Ukraine. Yana mentioned that there was an element of luck in all of this, right? There was an element that at the end of the day, the winter had not been so harsh up until now. But I would like to hear your opinions on what was done wrong and what was done actually correctly in the last year from the point of view of the European institutions. Was it just luck, the fact that there were no shortages of supply, or was it something else as well? And where do we stand in terms of the policies of transition? Was, for example, the Repower Europe plan the right solution for that time, or should we have gone beyond that as well? This is a question for all three of you, if I may. But let me also bring in some questions from the audience. Georgie Grau asks if, and this is perhaps for Yana, if the fact that we are trying to disengage ourselves from Russia, from the dependence on natural gas from Russia, if that's not going to move us towards dependence on China, in the sense that we are now moving towards electrification of our economy, and many of the raw materials that relate to that are actually coming from either other places, but also the industrial production of China, such as, for instance, photovoltaic generation. I also have a question particular for Christian. Joanna Argemi, and I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly. She asks, she says that you mentioned that one of the main challenges is the increasing price of oil, especially for emerging economies. Is there a role for developed countries? And I would add here, is there a role for the EU to support those developed economies in this type of situation? Natural gas seems to not be the answer for those countries. Many of those still rely on coal and oil. As you said, those that have the option of hydropower have already been using it. So what's the role of the EU in that dilemma, right, of helping countries developing while still keeping those target emissions? And so I would suggest that we do the tour de table once again for this round of questions, and do encourage the audience to keep on asking them via the Q&A button. Marie, would you like to start with that? What did the EU do right, and what did it do wrong?
Sure. Thanks, Gustavo. Big question. Let me maybe just offer a few ingredients, which I'm sure that Yana and Christian will have others to add to this particular question. Was it just luck? No. It was not just luck. So I think that, as I said before, the set of emergency measures that were put into place, given the constraints that we had at the time, were quite impressive. And I think that really there is merit to this. Now, would we have managed to avert a supply crisis if we had had a very, very strong winter? Well, probably yes, to the extent that households would have kept warm, but with regard to the industrial sector and reduction of the supply there, that would have been a different story, I think. So I think to some extent that this is part of the question. So was it just luck? No, there were strategies that were put into place based on what was possible at the time, also based on the balance that is between EU and member states. Lots of money was thrown into the picture as well. As Yana was saying before, storage would not have become as full as it did without the storage that happened over the summer, for example, and that included pricing out some of those other states that I think Christian has a question that he's going to address later. Energy efficiency measures were quite strong, and that's a combination of efforts both by the EU, its member states, and its citizens. So it's a combination of things, and luck played into it and certainly helped. But we'll see going forward, and specifically with regard to next winter, how well strategies continue to work, I would say. So perhaps on that point. On the question of China, I think Yana will probably jump into this one as well. So with regard to whether we are essentially just changing our dependencies and changing them from one supplier to another in this transition. Yes, to some extent that is a risk, but it's not just China. So it's China for many materials, but it's Congo for others, such as cobalt, and it's a risk in very different components of the new system that we need. It's a risk for grids. It's a risk for the materials we need for electricity generation. It's a risk for storage products, and so we will create new dependencies no matter what. They are a little bit different, I would say, in nature, because a dependency on a fossil fuel is continuous. And so when a shutoff happens, that can be quite abrupt unless you have storage in place. Whereas in these cases, there are materials that are needed for initial investment in a system, and after that, the system does run. So that doesn't mean that it's not as problematic. It just means that the pattern of disruptions is quite different in these kind of dependencies than in others. So yes, it is a risk, and yes, it's one that needs to be addressed. It's essentially one of the major points in these new geopolitics that I was talking about before, and work underway is underway on this. I mean, there's multiple aspects. Not all of the materials that we're talking about are actually scarce. Some of them are quite widespread across the globe. It's just a question of where it's socially, environmentally, and economically possible to extract them. And so a lot of the equation is going to be looking into that. Where else can this be produced, and what partnerships can we put into place, for example, to secure supply of these? But this is a major challenge, and we'll be seeing lots of work in this space going forward. So that's just some initial thoughts.
Thanks so much, Mary. Yana, on to you with these challenging questions as well.
No, thank you for the questions. I don't think they're challenging. I think they're very thought-provoking, and I think this is the beauty of that. So going back to the luck question, I do think that luck was extremely essential for us achieving what we managed to achieve. I do not negate by any way or circumstances what has been achieved politically and institutionally wise in terms of the rapid activation of the series of sanctions. I think this is absolutely applauding for the EU, because usually we are very slow in reacting, in managing to agree on issues. So this is fantastic. The Repower EU, the Save Gas for Winter package, the kind of demand reduction for gas and power measures that were uptaked across the EU. This is all great, and this is absolutely essential for us to have managed to achieve what we managed. But all modeling shows that if we were living in a normal environment where China was attracting LNG volumes that it was usually attracting, if the weather was not the absolutely inhabitual weather of this winter period, if the weather was a normal winter, and then if there was the global supply of LNG going as it's usually going towards China, where the price premium would have been even higher potentially than the EU would not have achieved the gas storage inventory levels or managing to bolster the system. So I think luck was extremely essential in the system, again, with the caveat that we should not negate that the EU was extremely effective in actually agreeing and implementing measures all across the Union. Then we should go back to the issue of how these measures are implemented at national level and what is this creating at a European level. As I mentioned in my intervention, some member states managed to buttress the system with a huge amount of fiscal fiscal injections in the system, which is creating a lot of instability in the European market. We have certain countries that have the very strong financial resources to be able to help the customers, but also the industry, and manage to shield a lot of the key consumers from these extremely important energy spikes. The utility sectors as well, something that I mentioned, but I think it's important for us to discuss that there is a massive utility bailout happening across the EU, and this is extremely concerning. And again, member countries which have actually the budget to bail out their utilities, again, are positioned in a much better position than financially weaker member states. What this is creating for the Union is extremely concerning. We have to pay attention to that going forward. And again, for the industries as well, financially weaker states would not be able to, despite of the relaxation of state aid, so on and so forth, would not be able to actually cushion a lot of their industries. And then at European level, a lot of the industries had to stop operating, and this will be permanent. A lot of I was reading this Eurometo letter from last October to the European institutions. 50% of the aluminium, 30% of the zinc production, I think it was 30% for silicon, has been idled across the EU in 2022. Some of this production would never come back. This is extremely concerning. So voila, I think these are extremely important issues for us to recognize and to say, yes, we achieved a lot. A lot has been implemented very successfully across the EU, but a lot of the things were a cacophony of measures that compromise the internal energy market, which, as I mentioned before, is the key achievement of EU energy policy evolution for the past 3 decades. And also it's a kind of potentially creating schisms in the system going forward. So luck was important to actually be where we are today, with all the kind of achievements being also admitted. Now then, in terms of the move to alternative types of dependencies, China is important, but also we should think about other types of dependencies. I'm doing analysis currently on the global LNG capacity. So in the future, there will be really a contraction of concentration of capacity of LNG volumes in the US and Qatar, which would actually increase the leverage of those states in terms of arbitraging volumes of LNG. So I think this is also something that we need to be extremely conscious of, especially in the context that Qatar is not the most democratic state out there, but also it's a state that is massively investing in key LNG infrastructure all across the world, including within the EU. So again, this is important. In terms of China, I think there is so much talk around the importance of the China's grip over rare earths and critical minerals. So I'm not going to recite all of those worries, but here the key issue is not only the access to those materials, but also the refining capacity. And this is what is actually extremely important today, because Mary mentioned that cobalt in Congo is another critical vector and point, but this cobalt is actually refined in China. So at the end of the day, the dependence that we have is on refining capacity. So we need to critically, and this is my advice always when I speak to institutional actors, to activate this refining capacity domestically, because even if we manage to stockpile all the critical rare materials that we identify in our critical raw materials lists, that are identified in this European Critical Raw Materials Alliance, in the Battery Alliance, this is all great, it is a fantastic achievement, but without refining capacity, what we're going to do with these stockpiles? We have to send them to China for it to refine. So important for us to pay attention to that. And then in terms of the global countries, there was a question on how to help developing countries that are reliant on coal. I think here what is extremely essential for the EU is to try to be a little bit more strategic and less ideological in terms of its approach to climate diplomacy. What we need to do, and this is absolutely essential for me, is to activate the coal to gas switching in developing countries, because today what we do is there is a massive pledge against investment of activating gas reserves for domestic use in a lot of the countries that actually have those gas reserves. So what we do today is we ask them to develop infrastructure and trade of gas for our markets, but we do not allow them to actually use those gas for their domestic markets. Absolutely nonsensical. So this has to be, needs to be made progress around this issue, and then activate the coal to gas switching globally, because the leapfrogging that we used to speak a few years back from very dirty generation to clean energy, decentralized renewable energy sources, today we see that there is a limit to that. So I think it's important for us to be a bit more strategic in terms of how to reduce emissions, so activate those kind of switching, and also thinking about all the gas infrastructure that the EU has accumulated over the past year. How many floating regasification terminals were put into place? How many more are coming this year? How many new links, and so on and so forth? By 2030, normally, most of this capacity would not be needed in the EU. We still have not started thinking about global rebalancing of gas markets in the period after 2030. So the EU can be a critical actor in terms of saying, okay, after the 2030 decade, maybe this capacity can be moved towards this and that market to activate those processes. And then just finally, because I'm conscious of time and I want Christian to share his wisdom as well, I think the hydrogen issue is extremely important. Christian very well underlined that it's an issue that, as I mentioned, it's a hype, but there is a lot of unclear and uncertain questions. I absolutely agree. There's so much wastage in terms of actually importing hydrogen to our soils. So it would be important for the EU to become a strategic actor to make industrial partnerships and activate manufacturing capacity of critical commodities and energy-intensive products close to the production of hydrogen, rather than making countries like Egypt, Namibia, just giving us green hydrogen and against entrapping them in this relationship of dependence to what the EU wants. So it's something that it's important for us to keep our kind of a global profile of power with value-driven foreign policy and conscious of the climate agenda.
Thanks so much, Yana, for this straightforward answer, and also for reminding us that there is a lot of interconnected issues that relate also to development, and that we should pay attention to the fact that by disentangle the European market from dependence with other countries, it might create dependence with others, and in particular, those dependencies might be detrimental to countries that are trying to develop. Indeed, Christian, you get the final word here, because we are running a little bit out of time. But because you got the final word, I'll add another question, which has to do with nuclear. Right, one of our members in the audience, Alvaro Mazarasa, he asks why nuclear is not considered to be the backup source in many EU state members. It's a question that deserves a lot of explanation, I'm sure, but I'm also sure you're going to be able to wrap that up in a few minutes. On to you, Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Gustavo. I'll stick to those questions which haven't been answered yet because of time constraints. And honestly, when it comes to this question that you just asked on nuclear, or that Alvaro was asking, I don't know. Or honestly, I know, but I could have asked the same question, I think, as you can guess, from my introduction earlier on. I think that we have seen, especially in Western Europe, I think this is not true for many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but we have seen in many countries in Western Europe, especially in the German-speaking countries, Germany and Austria, we have seen a relentless anti-nuclear campaign starting basically in the 70s. In Germany, very much related to the peace movement against nuclear weapons and against nuclear energy. And the environmental movement very strongly behind this, including Greenpeace, as you know. And now nobody gets out of this anymore, I have the impression. Honestly, if you look on all statistics about safety of nuclear, at least all studies that I can find, coal kills every year more people than have ever been killed in all nuclear accidents combined, by far. I mean, the studies that I know say coal kill between 11,000 people through fine particle emissions per year, between 11 and 20,000. You find a bit different numbers. I have not seen that kind of numbers for nuclear, by far not. Nuclear waste is a manageable issue. I mean, in Germany, I know the biggest, toxic waste disposal plant where, arsenic, mercury, and, elements that have no half-time, that stay toxic forever. They are stored underground. Nobody can tell me it is not possible to safely store nuclear waste. It is a political issue that in most countries we haven't found a solution to that. Now, when it comes to, so therefore, I'm certainly sure that based on science, and I mean, I find it mind-blowing that the same people who always rightly tell us we have to listen to the science when it comes to climate change, of course we have to follow the science, it's the best we can do, but we shouldn't follow the science when it comes to nuclear. It doesn't make sense, and I think we have to overcome this, because otherwise we are not going to fulfill our emission reduction goals. There is another issue with, increasing the share of renewables, wind and sun, beyond a certain degree. That means, of course, you don't only need to provide, replacement power generation when there is no wind and sun, but you also need to send the overshoot of wind and solar energy somewhere, because an electricity network always has to run on 330 volts, or it has to run on 50 hertz. I mean, we have different currencies, but it always has to run on 50 hertz. If it goes below 48, it will break down with a blackout. If it goes beyond 51 point something, it will break down. So that means you not only have to deal with shortages and, have replacement power, but you also need to deal with overshoot energy. For example, if you have a lot of sun in the summer. And then there is, of course, the problem of raw materials that has been mentioned already. But I think some people underestimate the scale of this, the amounts of raw materials from copper to rare earth minerals that we need. Would we really have the ambition to have an energy transformation all over the world? Because, of course, we don't want to only reach emission reduction goals in Europe, but in the end, we have to go to net zero globally. I mean, the amount of mines we would have to open to provide enough materials is going to be a problem. So what I'm saying is I'm not, against developing more renewable energy. I think this is a path we have to go, but it is not the silver bullet, because there is no silver bullet. And just one last answer regarding the question, how bad is gas in comparison? I don't want to say gas is bad. If countries, and for example, the numbers I know from Norway are excellent. Norway is really taking care not to have methane leakage at the wells and in the transport system. And then gas, is very good. But if you look on US fracking gas, but also on Russian gas infrastructure, there's quite a lot of leakage. So gas is already looking less good. And one last remark, because I didn't mention it earlier and I actually wanted to, there is also an issue with hydrogen leakage, which nobody talks about actually. This is the smallest element on Earth. It will be very difficult not to have leakage on a larger scale, because basically it goes through most metals. I mean, very few materials are able to, have hydrogen H2 not leaking. What happens if it leaks? Well, we don't know so exactly, because we have very little free H2 in the atmosphere, but we do know that H2 reacts with OH, hydroxyl. And what does hydroxyl normally do? It breaks down methane, and it takes care that methane is not too long in the atmosphere. Hydroxyl also breaks down ozone. So that means if we have larger amounts of H2 in the atmosphere, it will occupy the hydroxyl. So instead of the hydroxyl breaking down methane and ozone, it will be occupied with the H2. I mean, we know still very little about this. I mean, what it will mean in reality, but we have to be very careful, because, as I said earlier, methane is contributing 25% to global warming. If we let it stay longer in the atmosphere, of course, its global warming potential will increase. So everybody who is involved on the hydrogen issue, please keep having a look on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen, very much for pointing out to the risks of also the new technology. And thank you to all the presenters and the speakers for highlighting that while the webinar was on energy security, there are so many interlinkages with a variety of other policy areas, such as, for example, industrialization and reindustrialization in many countries in this period of transition. There's also an issue of equity when it comes to the production, but also the consumption of energy. Climate justice was very much highlighted throughout the interventions. So the Russian war in Ukraine has definitely accelerated many of these trends, but these trends have been there for quite a while, and they will certainly outlive as well the conflict in the East. So it's important definitely to keep on having a look on issues of energy security, and in particular the geopolitics and the geoeconomic issues. Thank you to our panelists. I'm afraid we have run out of time, despite all the complex issues that we could have been developing for much longer. Thank you to the audience. We encourage you to have a look at the Engage website for the recording of this session and the previous ones as well. There's a webinar on sanctions, and there's a webinar on the strategic compass of the European Union that you can already find on the Engage website. That's engage-eu.eu. Also make sure to subscribe to our newsletter so you don't miss our upcoming events as well in 2023. And until then, goodbye from our side, and thank you once again to our panelists. Goodbye.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.